I want to welcome everyone to the tea tasting with tea expert and BCIT alumnus Matt Chong, sponsored by the BCIT Alumni Association. My name is Allie Siemens, and I'm the Alumni Relations Manager at BCIT, and I am happy to be emceeing this evening event. We're thrilled that you are all joining us and hope you have your tea kits near. We're going to get started with some housekeeping notes. So as everyone can see on the slide in front of them, this is a Zoom webinar meeting, meaning we are not able to see your smiling faces and you do not have to worry about keeping yourself muted. We would love to keep you all engaged with Matt throughout the evening, so as questions pop into your head, please use the Q&A box to type your questions, and I will ask Matt at the appropriate time. For those who have not used the polls function before, we will be utilizing them throughout the program. And as a reminder, once we've shared the results with you, you have the opportunity to X out of that pop-up yourself. So we will remind you after the first poll, just in case folks are confused with how that one works. We are recording this webinar, and the Alumni Relations team will email everybody a link of the recording as it becomes available. So don't worry, if you're willing to share this with friends and family, please do so. So for those who haven't used the Zoom chat function, toggle your responses to all audience members and panelists so we can all see your comments. And we're going to kick off the evening by asking everyone to please tell us, where in the world are you joining from? Are you a BCIT alumni? And if so, what program did you graduate from? So please throw that into the chat. I see we have a couple answers coming in here. We've got Irene from Burnaby. We've got Samantha from Toronto. Thank you. GTA area, Port Coquitlam. We got folks coming in from all over. Burnaby, BCIT, Surrey alum. Vancouver, does anybody get the furthest reach award? Edmonton. Ooh, Louisville, fantastic. Wonderful, thank you everybody, that's great. Keep those comments coming in and absolutely make use of the chat function to connect with folks. So moving into our program, I would like to acknowledge that the BCIT campuses, all 5 of them, are located on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We would invite everybody to check out the resources that Anna is going to pop into the chat, nativeland.ca or whosland.ca. These are fantastic resources that use GIS technology to assist users in identifying Indigenous nations, territories, and communities across Canada and the US. Anna, thanks for popping those into the chat for everybody. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to grab my own tea kit, which I have set up here right in front of me, and I'm going to pass it over to Matt. So Matt, thank you so much. If you would please introduce yourself to everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And a huge thank you to the BCIT Alumni Association and for all of you for attending tonight. Welcome to our virtual tea house. We're very excited to have you. I think what I love most about tea is not only the flavor and the culture, but also the fact that it brings people together like tonight. So what I'm excited to be sharing with you tonight is a few different things about teaware, brewing tea, and of course, just what the flavors and the tasting is how it's experienced. And so one of the things that if you've ever done a wine tasting before or a whiskey tasting, I think you're going to find some similarities here. I know, tea is one of the most well-consumed beverages in the world, but I find what we know about it, whether it's the complexity of the flavor, the way it looks, and even the way people drink it around the world is very different. So we're going to try to keep tonight as interactive as possible. If you haven't purchased a tea kit but still want to participate, I'd recommend just grabbing 3 cups, 3 types of tea from your house and 3 spoons, and you can absolutely participate along with us. So what I'll start with is sort of how I founded Chong Tea Co about 4 years ago. So I've always loved tea, and I grew up in Vancouver drinking tea with my family. It was very much a big part of our tradition. And I moved here to Toronto, and I've often found that community around tea and also the access to incredible teas was a little bit different. Toronto's a bigger city. Things are a bit further away. And I started researching a lot of different tea traditions. And one of the biggest things that always reminded me of BC and Vancouver was tea culture. And that's when I started to share my passion for tea, and also to start studying tea as a tea sommelier, and really bring that to life through educational experiences. So tonight we're going to get a bit of a taste of that. I was saying to my friend earlier tonight that I wish we had 4 hours because there's so many things I could talk to you about. But as I mentioned, we do want to keep this as interactive as possible. So where I'll start is what is tea? When we think about tea, there's lots of different kinds of tea these days with modern invention. There's bubble tea, there's the tea lattes you see out there. There's even tea cocktails, which I personally love. But there's really a whole realm out there. But what tea is any sort of plant from the Camellia genus. So Camellia sinensis, Camellia samica, or the Camellia cambodia. So any of these three plants are the tea producing plants officially grown in tea producing countries around the world, like China, India, West Africa, Japan, Taiwan. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on 3 teas that I very much enjoy. If you purchase the tea kit, you'll notice that these teas are quite interesting and rare. And so they're from 3 very common cultivars. However, they're quite rare in both the quality and the flavors of the tea. So the 3 teas that we've chosen for tonight are a Oolong Jing green tea, which has these beautiful flaky green sort of spears, which we'll be talking about the teas in more depth later. The Gaba Oolong, which is a really interesting high altitude oolong tea from Taiwan, and then the Yunnan Hongcha from China, which has these beautiful golden leaves with an aroma that's very chocolatey, kind of mocha, very, very interesting. So in addition to that, in addition to these 3 teas, any tea sort of falls into a few different categories. So it could be a white tea that looks like this. This is an aged white tea, so it looks a little bit darker, but typically the lighter sort of white leaves. It could be a yellow tea, which is quite rare, and from a production perspective is similar to green tea. Green tea, oolong, black tea, and then any sort of post-fermented aged tea. So those are kind of what's classified as specifically tea. Anything outside of that, whether it's a herbal beverage like chamomile tea or ginger tea, I know there's definitely a few people who love lemon ginger, as I do. Those are all called tisanes or herbal teas. And then there's also Rooibos, which is actually a full separate category by itself, equally delicious. I always say to people that when it comes to tea, anything that you love that's sort of infused as a leaf can be considered tea, but officially it does have to fall into one of these 6 categories. So if you have your tasting kit here, you'll notice there's a few different features here that we want to make sure that you had. So obviously the 3 tea samples, which I mentioned, as well as some fillable tea bags, and these you'll be using to infuse just shortly. And then at home, you will have a few cups, some spoons to taste as well, which we'll get into just shortly. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and boil my water here. One of the first teas that we're going to be drinking and tasting is the Oolong Jing. So I want to make sure our water is set to about 180 to 185. I have the advantage of having a variable temperature kettle. When we talk about tea, temperature is a very important thing. So where I'll sort of start when it comes to tasting tea and making tea is teaware. So you'll see that on this table here, I have quite a few different things, which I'll speak to. But I would say the most important things as you're brewing tea is really around having a good vessel to brew the tea. You want to focus on having good quality water. And what I mean by that is there's often a lot of conversations around, should the water be spring water? Should it be mineral water? Should it be a specific kind of water? I always say to start with tap water and then also experiment with your leaves and see what works out. When it comes to water in itself, the most important thing is just to make sure that you've got a right ratio of water to tea leaves so that you're not, you don't have too much water, so it's going to be tea that's very strong, or too little water, which too much water, which is going to make the infusion too weak. So the other thing as well that I always recommend is to have a portable scale. So a scale is really interesting because it helps you to actually get very granular to, what kind of tea, I guess the amount of tea that you have. So for example, whenever I'm doing a proper tasting to identify a leaf, I usually use about 2.5 to 3 grams. That's kind of what's in a tea bag. But when you come to big loose leaves, like for example, these leaves are huge. So you definitely want a tool that will help you measure what the quantity of that tea is. The other thing is that you want a kettle that is basically easy to carry. So like I typically like a gooseneck kettle here because these types of kettles have a really nice spout. When it comes to brewing tea, we want oxygen to be able to go into the leaves and infuse them. And so that passage makes it very easy to do that. The other thing as well is you want a tablespoon, something to very easily measure out how much tea that you want within your cup. And then of course, your favorite brewing vessel. So for me, I love using a traditional gaiwan, which is called a lidded cup. A gaiwan is a very traditional way of brewing tea, which I'll be demonstrating a little bit later on. This is a nice little functional device where you can actually drink the tea like that, or you can actually steep it and then pour it into another device. If you've been to dim sum before, you've probably seen it, and it's a very great tool for brewing tea. So I've covered some of the different teaware pieces. I've talked a little bit about temperature. So when it comes to different teas, on the temperature side, I think the rule of thumb, especially if you don't remember the exact temperatures, is anything that's before boiling should be your oolongs, your whites, your greens, and then also your yellow teas. Anything that's boiling and after boiling, so the water's come to a boil and it sits, you can definitely do your darker oolong teas, your black teas, as well as your pu'ers. So our water has boiled. And I think what we'll do first is go through our first tea, which is the Longjing green tea. So Longjing here actually means dragon well. And so dragon well is actually representative of a place in China where this tea grows. So this tea came to popularity not just because of the look and the feel, but because of the tea liquor, which is incredibly delicious. So what I'd recommend you do is to take your fillable tea bag, grab your scoop, and you're going to put a little bit of it in the tea bag here. So the benefit of the fillable tea bag is that if you don't have an infuser at home, it helps you to separate the leaves out. And so if you do have an infuser, you can definitely use that as well.
So Matt, we had a few folks ask a question about, well, one, we had a Celsius to Fahrenheit question for those folks who are joining us from different areas of the world. But other than that, can you tell us a little bit more about the dragon well or where that comes from? Absolutely.
So dragon well comes from an area in China that the terroir is really well known for sweet and sort of very light green teas. So the actual processing method is what defines the flavor, but the actual, the region in itself, it comes out as the tea maker builds it. So for example, one of my favorite teas is pu'er, and the pu'er tea that I enjoy grows around a lot of camphor trees. So as we brew the tea, even though the processing method doesn't have camphor in it, we taste it because it's part of the plant. I see a couple questions actually coming up about measurements, which I can
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah. So what's in terms of grams? So 2.5 grams is probably about, sorry, I think it's about 4 grams is about a teaspoon. So for the purposes of the tasting today, I would recommend doing probably about 2.5 grams, so a half teaspoon within the tea bag. And the reason why is we're actually going to be using very little water, so about this much. This is 200 milliliters of water. And the reason why is that we want to really taste the tea and really and use less water so that we're getting those tasting notes. Before we brew this tea, I also want to talk a little bit about tea tasting as a profession. So one of the neat things I learned as I was studying tea professionally was that there's a whole job around tasting teas. So whenever you see, you know, a tea bag in the tea shop or, sorry, in the grocery store, or a loose leaf tea in a tea shop, all of that has had to be tasted by somebody before it gets to market. And so they'll typically use a device that's like this. So as you can see, also very small. It's basically a cupping device. And typically what you do is you put a little bit of leaves inside, you pour the water in, and then that goes into a bowl. And so if what tea tasters typically do is they'll taste about 200 to 300 different teas. They'll have a whole table, probably bigger than this, and everybody will just go around and taste the tea. And that's sort of how they get a very good understanding of, you know, say for example, there's a whole lot of black tea that they want to taste. They'll be able to go in and really understand the nuances, and they have the palate to be able to taste it. And were there a couple of other questions, Ali, that came up?
All right, so you're going to hear my water boiling right beside my computer, something I don't do very often, but just confirming the amount of tea in the tea bag. And somebody asking how you spell that teacup name that you had just identified. The teaware.
Oh, yes. Sorry, this little guy right here, the...
Yeah, let's go with that one first. If we need some clarification, we'll find it.
Yes, so this is a traditional cupping set. They come in a pair, and this is used by professional tea tasters to actually taste the tea. The one last thing that's part of the set is actually a spoon, which you would actually use to taste it. For the tea bag, yes, so we need probably about 2.5 grams, which is about a half teaspoon. So we're using less tea, yes. And I can actually just show you what that looks like if I can get a top-down camera here. So it's probably about this much tea. Oh, that much tea. There you go. And this is the Dragon Well, the Longjing tea. So this, the Dragon Well Longjing tea is actually one of the most famous cultivars within China. And what's interesting about this tea as well is the unique flavor, the lightness of it, but also the way the leaves look. So one of the things as we're steeping is I'll tell you a little bit more about green tea. So when it comes to processing methods, there's really, you know, two main ways that we see green tea as it comes to the loose leaf. So the first is, you know, Japanese green tea. So if you've had genmatcha or sencha green tea at a sushi restaurant, you'll notice that the flavors are very vegetal. They're very, they taste kind of like seaweed and lots of umami and kind of have that steamed sort of quality. I always equate it to sort of fresh vegetables. The Chinese method, which this is actually closer to, uses a pan frying method. So the pan frying method actually results in more of a lightly roasted flavor, more kind of, I always kind of say like cereal grains and just different, kind of almost like a dry flavor. And so with either of these teas, you definitely don't want to oversteep it or have the water too hot, because what'll happen is because of the processing method of dehydrating the tea leaves, there's a lot of tannins in there. So if you're a wine drinker, you'll know that a wine that's very tannic is obviously very bitter, or it kind of gives that dry throat feeling. So similar to the green tea, if you oversteep it, then it's going to result in some not so great flavors. Okay, so we've put the tea in the tea bag. We're going to start filling it with some water. So you probably want to fill your cup up by about, if you have just a standard mug, I would say fill it up 1/4 to halfway. We want to make sure that there's enough room for the tea leaves to be able to expand, but also that the tea is being steeped for a pretty short period of time. So we're only going to do this for about 2 minutes.
So would you say that's about 1 cup of water, Matt?
Yeah, that's probably about 1 cup of water.
1 cup of water, fantastic. So maybe while we are steeping here, we could check and see what the audience, what their favorite type of tea normally is. I know we were curious to see what folks may be drinking on a regular basis. So they may see a poll pop up on their screen there, and everybody has an opportunity to vote and tell us what your favorite kind of tea is. All right, I'm seeing the answers in real time, but you guys have a few Few more seconds here. Almost everybody has provided an answer. We go 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So I will share the results, and it looks like we have a majority of the crowd is a black tea drinker, followed by green tea. So very interesting. There we go. Thanks, folks. So feel free to X out of that one, and you can get rid of those results from your screen.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, when you look at the way that tea is consumed in terms of you know, a lot of black tea in the morning versus green. So our tea is almost ready. Before I go into it, I'll say one of the steps actually I just missed, which we'll do next time, is you always want to rinse your leaves first. So the reason why you want to do that is you want to get rid of any debris that's within the tea, and you also want to use that water to actually open up the tea leaves as well. So if you haven't done it, not a big deal at all. In traditional Chinese tea ceremony, which I'll show you, there's actually a step to do that. So yeah. All right, so that's been about 2 minutes. So we're going to take our tea bag out, and we are going to decant it in our cup. Okay, so we'll let that cool down for a second.
Matt, maybe before you jump, sorry to interrupt you there, maybe before you jump into that, we just have a few questions here. You know, would you ever squeeze your tea bag out to get all that extra deliciousness out of there? And why do you decant?
Of course, yes. So when it comes to the extra water within that tea bag, a good sign of a really good quality tea is actually that you can infuse it multiple times. And so that water will just stay with the tea. If we want to do another infusion, we can definitely add more water, and those flavors will eventually get through. So typically, a really good quality tea, you should be able to steep about 3 to 5 times in about a cup of water. If you put it into a pot, you can steep it less just because there's a lot of water there. So those flavors might come out. The other thing as well is that if you're worried about caffeine for any of these teas, I would recommend steeping it in there for 30 seconds, pour it out, and then just steep it again. You won't lose any of the quality of the flavor, but about 85% of the caffeine will come out of the leaves. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
You're welcome. So before we get to tasting, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about tea tasting and sort of how it's different than tea drinking. So the reason why we're using quantities that are a little bit smaller is because we want to really understand the leaf. When we have smaller quantities of water and smaller quantities of tea, it really allows us to really get a sense and a feel of the flavor, primarily because the tea liquor, as we can see here, it's very light, but it's much more intense than it would be if you had just put it into a big mug or put it into a pot. The other thing as well is if we notice as we're drinking that there's different flavors that are either maybe not what we thought of, but or you know, they might be a little bit different, we can actually play around with it as well. So when it comes to the sensory aspect of tea tasting, there's 5 senses. So there's sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami. Tea really hits on all those different aspects. And one of the most important things as well is really understanding the aroma of a tea. So before you drink a tea, one of the things I always recommend is to take the dry leaves and give it a bit of a smell. And the reason why is you want to understand, does it smell fresh? You know, what are the characteristics of the dry leaf that the tea maker was really trying to get out in the leaves? The other thing as well is that if you've had a tea, whether it's a green tea for about over 6 months or a black tea for over a year, tea may have gone bad. So it's not harmful to drink, but it just won't taste as great as it would had it been fresh tea. So I'm going to take a bit of a smell here from the Dragon Well green tea, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I think. So there's beautiful sweet honey notes there. It's very floral, which is a defining characteristic of this tea. I'm smelling melons, a little bit of peaches as well. And a bit of a hint of strawberry. So I'm really curious to see how this actually tastes and what the aroma of the tea liquor is that we've all brewed here. The other thing as well, before we take a sip of that, is within the notebooks that you all have, if you have the tasting kit, I'd like you to open up the notebook and to write down a couple of things, which we'll also put in the chat. And this is just so that you can start recording the teas that you're drinking and some of the different characteristics. So I'd like you to write down the name of the tea, which is Long Jing. It's also on the tea package, where it's from, so China. What the type of tea is. So this is a green tea. And then we can sort of add some of the notes that we started with as well. So what did the dry leaf smell like? Another thing that we'll add is, what does the tea liquor taste like? What are the tasting notes? The third thing is going to be about the wet leaf, which we'll get to in a second. And I'll show you sort of how to evaluate the wet leaves once we've drank the tea. So I'm going to take a pause there for a second in case anybody has any questions before we start tasting.
Hey, that's fantastic, Matt. And I think one of the things leading up to tasting the Long Jing is we had quite a couple people, or a number of people, ask about Rooibos and how it fits into its own category. Wondering,
sure.
I know we're talking about the Long Jing, but are you able to talk to us a little bit about Rooibos?
Of course. So Rooibos is technically an herb. So it actually falls within a different classification of plant. So it technically is not a tea. So it's not from the Camellia genus, but it's equally delicious. And if you want to call it tea, then I'm totally fine with that.
Okay, now some of us know that we're not tea experts for real. So thank you for clarifying that one for us.
Hey, we're all on a journey.
Yes, absolutely.
It's an herbal tea. Yes.
A journey indeed. So Matt, maybe right before we head into this next aspect of it, maybe it's a good time to ask folks how often they drink tea. So as we're identifying this journey together, are we tea drinkers often? Do we drink tea multiple times a day? Are we newbies to the tea world? Myself, I know that I'm personally an afternoon tea drinker. So let's see what the general consensus is in the audience here. We'll give folks a few more seconds. All right, folks. So there you go. We've got a big tea drinking audience here. So Matt, I'm sure people are eager to take this next step with you.
Perfect. That's great. And I'm glad to hear that everybody is big tea drinkers and obviously very excited to learn. Okay, so we've decanted the tea from our tea brewing device into a cup. So the reason, I noticed that there was a question before about why do we decant the tea? And the reason is quite simple. We want to make sure that there's oxygen within the tea so that we can actually taste the flavor compounds within the tea itself. The secondary reason is also because when we have hot tea, even though it's green tea, so it's not super hot, we want to actually cool it down a little bit so that way when we use our spoon to take a sip, it's not going to scald our throat. All right, so let's get sipping. And so actually one of the things I'll ask Ali, if you want to put the tasting wheel up, that might be helpful for everyone if they want to actually classify what they think the tea tastes like.
Yes, absolutely. So I believe Anna just shared that in the chat for those folks who want to download the PDF right there to their desktop.
Okay. And so the method for tea tasting is we want to take a little scoop of the tea, and we're gonna sip it very quickly so the water molecules the tea molecules get in the back of our throat. The reason why we want to do that is we want to expand all of those flavor compounds across all of our tongue, and that way we'll get a really good understanding of what this tea tastes like. And slurping is totally okay. So the first thing I notice right off the top is this tea is very smooth. It has, I don't really taste any bitterness at all. It has a very round flavor to it. The actual sweetness comes out, but it's very even. It doesn't feel too sweet. I'm also getting that melon flavor that I got from the dry leaf within this as well. So it also has a touch of a savoriness to the back in the finish, but it's a very even wine. I kind of call Jing, like the Sauvignon Blanc of tea. It's very, very easy drinking. It's not necessarily too sweet, but very delicious. One of the things as well that we want to do as we're tasting is to smell the aromas of the tea as well, because that will help us inform sort of what we're drinking. So I definitely get some notes of some baking spices as well, and obviously lots of floral notes and sort of like summer fruit in the aromas. And the tea itself is, you know, it has that sweetness throughout, but not overwhelming. That's delicious. I would love to hear some of your thoughts in the chat of what sort of flavor notes are you tasting? So as you're thinking about the sort of what are the flavor notes that you're tasting on here, what I'll do is I'm actually going to brew this tea using a full infusion. So that means I'm not going to put it in a tea bag. I'm just going to put it into into this decanter here, and that will actually help the leaves expand. So one of the ways I love to brew green tea in is a infusion beaker like this. A simple Pyrex measuring cup is also great. And the reason why is that because green tea is very temperamental to temperature, we want to make sure that there's enough air escaping so that we're not cooking the leaves. I think for a lot of people who say they don't like green tea, I truly believe it's probably because it hasn't been prepared ideally, or perhaps the water was too hot, or perhaps the leaf itself, the quality may have been a bit off. The other thing too is I want us to look at the tea liquor here. So the liquor is very smooth and very rich here. It has this beautiful golden color, which is a characteristic of the Longjing green tea. This is a tea that you could drink all day long and really feel very refreshed. I drink Longjing a lot in the summer because it has a bit of a cooling effect, similar to peppermint herbal teas. So I'm going to go ahead and pour that out.
That's an interesting one, Matt. And we had lots of folks identify the flavors that they had specifically noted. And you mentioned that you drink this in the summer. So one of the questions I know we had for the audience is do folks have a main season for drinking tea? I've personally been a white wine drinker in the winter, or pardon me, in the summer. So I think people may have some of their own thoughts on season if I can get this poll to launch in front of me. So give me 1 second here. All right, folks, do you have a main season for drinking tea? We also had one question about caffeine content in the tea, Matt. So we're just going to end the polling here. And if you're able to maybe kick off an answer to that one, that would be fantastic. So here we are, folks. Here are your results. So we have lots of people who are drinking tea to energize in the morning, followed by a close second of wellness and health benefits. So maybe about that caffeine, Matt, what do you think?
For sure. So typically black teas have the most amount of caffeine in them. So I would definitely, if you're sensitive to caffeine, I'd always say enjoy them in the mornings, or make sure that you steep those leaves for 30 seconds and then pour it out, and then basically steep them again. Green tea has less caffeine, about 70 to 90 milligrams of caffeine. I would say what's interesting thing about tea though is that they are there's a compound within tea called L-theanine that's actually calms the nervous system, and it has a very relaxing effect to it. So whereas coffee, you get kind of this like hockey stick of energy, which I enjoy coffee every morning, as well as tea, then I would say green tea is a bit of like a linear curve. So it goes up slowly, eases you in, and then comes back down. So caffeine within tea, you'll notice that you feel it less. It's almost like a very light energy. If you are looking to get say in the morning you're looking for something a little bit brisker that's not coffee, I always recommend vintage teas as they have a really great, robust flavor as well as great caffeine. And I noticed a question as well earlier about what teas would be enjoyed cold. Ali, do you mind if
Yes,
I answer that as
thank
well?
you, please.
Yeah, of course. So one of the the great inventions I've seen on Amazon is these really great, they're sort of like iced tea containers, and they're amazing. So the types of tea that I use those containers for in the summer, and there's always something in my fridge. Any sort of green teas are really great. Any sort of roasted teas are really good. I would recommend steeping them for about 2 days. For green teas, overnight is just fine. White teas make the most incredible iced tea. I always add a bit of honey to it when I actually decant it into a glass. They're really, really delicious, and white teas also are really interesting if you're looking to experiment with cocktails. But I would say put any tea in the fridge, see what it's like. You'll be surprised at the results. One time I've actually made iced tea out of pu'er tea, which is a roasted, a post-fermented tea, and the flavors that came out of that were really interesting. So I think one of the neat things about tea is the flavor and the dynamic nature of it. That's always changing. So experiment and see what you come up with.
That's fantastic. And how long would you typically suggest somebody steep a white tea for?
Yeah, so for a white tea, it depends on how big your brewing vessel is. So for example, if you have something like this that's about 2 cups, I would probably brew it for about 2 to 2.5 minutes. And then if you have something smaller, that's say this size, you're only going to want to brew that for about 30 seconds, and then just keep pouring the infusions out. But if you're using a smaller brewing vessel, you only need to steep it multiple times so that the infusions come out. And for iced white tea, I would say overnight, similar to green. So yellow, green, and white teas for iced tea or cold brew is overnight's just fine. But again, I would try it out and see what works best. It depends. Usually when I'm making iced tea, I don't typically measure. I just sort of like throw something into one of those canisters, and if I find it's too strong, the next time I'll just use less.
Fantastic. All right, now if anybody is like me and excitedly watching the chat and watching you, what are my next steps that I need to have in front of me?
All right, so if you haven't already, I would make sure that you've written down what sort of aromas or characteristics you've seen within the dry leaf. So in these dry leaves for the Longjing, I would definitely say very interesting sort of spear-like shape. The tea liquor is very golden, which is very consistent with the cultivar and the varietal of the tea plant. And then also write down sort of any aromas that you've gotten from either the dry leaf or the wet leaves as well. So one of the things that's actually a perfect segue onto the wet leaves is you'll notice that we've got some beautiful looking tea leaves here. What I always like to do is when I look at, after I finish an infusion, I always like to look at the leaves just to see how evenly the leaves are and also what color they are. If you see a very dull, not bright leaves after steeping them, it will tell you something about the quality of the leaves. So here what I've done is I've just sort of laid out the individual tea leaves out here that have been steeped. These have you'll notice that they have a very uniform two buds here, which is a character of the Longjing green tea. You'll notice the color throughout is very even. There's some parts of it that are brown right at the bottom, but generally you could actually see some pretty even colors throughout. The last thing we want to do, which we want to write in our notebook, is any aromas that we're getting from the wet leaf. So I definitely get a bit more vegetable sort of notes as well as a bit more savory sort of notes as well from this. Okay, so that is our Longjing green tea. We've given enough actually so that you can actually enjoy some more later. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can answer them. But we are going to move on to Oolong teas next. So what I'd like you to do is to take your package of Gaba Oolong Tea. you're going to basically open it up, give it a bit of a smell. And if you've got your infusion ready, or your cup that you want to pour it in, you can just pour it in the cup. That way you can get a good idea of what the smells like. So this tea is very fruity. Typically, Taiwanese oolong teas are really interesting because they grow at very high altitudes. And so the tea leaves actually have to work very hard because there's not a lot of oxygen up there. So what's neat is that as the tea leaves are working very hard to grow, that actually boosts the amount of aroma and flavor sort of compounds within the tea. But the drawback is it also means that there's less tea leaves. So it's sort of like you have less tea leaves, but higher quality teas. At lower elevations, you have more tea leaves, but just different flavor. So you definitely, with this tea specifically, it's a very, very interesting tea that, as you can see even from the aromas, is going to be pretty exciting to brew. So once you smell the dry leaf, I'd like you to take a scoop of the tea and then put it into your tea bag. So for this one, I'm going to actually show you how we would brew this as part of a Taiwanese tea ceremony. So what's interesting about the Taiwanese tea ceremony is that it takes a lot of things from the Chinese tea ceremony. However, it actually adds a really fun element to it, which is called an aroma cup. So it's a tall, skinny little cup like this. And what you do is that you pour the tea in there, and the cone nature of it actually allows you to smell some really, really cool aromas from the tea. And so we typically use this within the tea ceremony when we really want to identify a type of tea.
Hey, Matt, that's a pretty cool piece of information. I definitely did not know that. And perhaps a fantastic segue to the one question about, is there a scent palate cleanser for tea drinking?
Yes, I would say coffee beans are a really good choice. Coffee beans, anytime you're looking at trying to sort of reset your aroma, your palate, yeah, it's a great tool.
Fantastic. So coffee beans, just like in the Fragrance Center at the Bay. And we also have just a follow-up question on the caffeine amount inside the green tea. Would you say that folks who may be sensitive to caffeine should maybe steer away from tasting any of these this evening, or what would be your recommendation?
Yep, I would say you definitely want to steep the teas for about 30 seconds in about a cup of water, pour it out, and then you can be brewing them. So that most of the caffeine actually does come out when you brew the tea in the first infusion, and that will kind of come out. And if you're very worried, then I would just make sure that you're taking a couple of sips, and then definitely leave the rest for the next day.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Matt.
You're welcome. Okay, so for this one, you're just going to take a scoop of your Gaba Oolong Tea here, and then put it in the tea bag. I'm going to show you how to do it from a Gaiwan perspective as part of a Taiwanese tea ceremony. And so what you're going to do is you're going to brew the tea in the same way that we did previously. So within your second cup. And then from there, I'll guide you onto decanting it into your bowl.
All right. So earlier you had mentioned that a white tea may be a good option for perhaps making a cocktail or something of that nature. And I know when we were talking in the planning of this event, we wanted to ask, what types of tea do people drink? And that may include things like bubble tea or matcha or tea-based cocktails. So outside of the hot tea that we assume people are drinking, what other ways are people drinking their tea? And you feel free to click off as many options that make sense to you folks. All right, I can't keep track of what the popular one is going to be this time. We'll give you 3 more seconds to share your answers with the group. Got Samantha sharing that she loves matcha tea lattes. I do too. That's usually a nice treat for me if I go for a walk over lunch. All right, folks, let's see what everybody says. We'll share the results. So hot tea is definitely the leading contender, but we do have some folks who enjoy the matcha tea and bubble teas, and just 8 people who like tea-based cocktails.
It's
Over
funny,
to
as
you,
a
Matt.
purist, yeah, I was just gonna say, as a purist, I love the idea of tea-based cocktails because I always think of, oh, maybe we could put a green tea with some gin or a oolong tea with, some bourbon, or there's some really interesting combinations out there. But I definitely enjoy my tea hot in a traditional way. So I commend anyone who's been able to do some exploration in that area. So before we steep our oolong tea, and as mentioned, I'm going to be showing you a little bit about how we would steep this using a Taiwanese tea ceremony. I'll tell you a little bit about oolong tea. So oolong tea comes in many different forms. You'll see sort of some rolled and stemmed ones like this. Sometimes they come in sort of like long leaves. The big defining characteristic of oolong tea is oxidation. So oolong teas are oxidized for about 40 to 60%. So when it comes to oxidation, if a oolong tea is between 40 and 70%, you're going to get these beautiful green oolong teas that look almost like the color of green tea, but they'll look a little bit different because they'll be have more of a rolled shape to them. If you look at oolong teas that are between 40 to 70%, those are actually going to be more roasted flavors. So this is some of your famous Da Hong Power Big Red Robes, or any of your sort of charcoal roasted green teas as well. So that's kind of the defining thing about it. When it comes to caffeine level, sort of in between green and black teas, oolong teas are very, very famous in Taiwan and China. It's the one of the most consumed beverages there. And I think when I first started drinking tea, oolong was actually my favorite. I loved a tea called Tea Kuan Yin, which is a famous cultivar and variety of tea, and it comes in many forms, sometimes charcoal, sometimes by itself. And so what we're going to be bringing up here is a Gaba Oolong Tea. So the Gaba part of it is actually an infusion of a chemical, a very healthy chemical that we naturally produce that's very good. It's very calming. This tea itself comes from Nantao in Taiwan. It's a very famous tea growing region that also is high altitude. So it's great because, as I mentioned before, when the tea leaves have to work really hard to grow, we're going to experience some amazing flavors from this. So if you haven't already decanted your tea, make sure that you've taken your tea bag out and you've decanted your tea, and then look at some of the aromas from that as well, and then add that into your notebook. So what I'm doing here is I'm rinsing the tea leaves just to open it up. I'm heating up my fair cup. So in Chinese and Taiwanese tea ceremony, this is called a fair cup. It's meant to decant the tea so that the leaves stay within the gaiwan itself. And then we're also heating up our tea vessels.
So Matt, 2 questions here. You might have to help me on the pronunciation of one. So there's no theanine in Rooibos, and all tea has elements of caffeine?
So yes, so Rooibos, I believe, doesn't have L-theanine. I will have to double check on that because because it's not part of the Camellia genus plant, then it should have a very different flavor profile.
Fantastic.
But yes, very much an herbal tea.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for helping me on the pronunciation of that one. And then another question from Samantha. Should you pour the water into your cup in any specific way, or does it matter? Any tips of the trade?
Yeah, for sure. If you have a gooseneck kettle such as this, I always like to do it in a rounded fashion. So kind of like a big circle. And the reason why I like to do that is because it sort of allows you to get even coverage of the tea. You're also adding oxygen as the water falls as well. So sometimes it's a show thing, but generally I find it presents very well as you're tasting tea. So because this is a very small brewing vessel, I'm only going to brew this for about 30 seconds. I just saw a question come up about how do we rinse a tea bag. So what I would do is probably just pour a little bit of liquid, so maybe about this much in, and then just pour out that liquid, and then you can actually re-steep it. Okay, so the sign of a really well-made gaiwan like this is actually in the thickness of it. So if a gaiwan is too thick, it's very heavy, very difficult to manage. I have small hands, so not ideal. If it's too thin, the water, when it touches it, it becomes very hot and it makes it very difficult to handle. So this is a pretty well-made gaiwan. I think one of the reasons why drinking out of a gaiwan is one of my favorite ways to do it is because it travels very easy, and also it gives you a lot of control over the leaves. So we can get an overhead here. I can just show you what the steeping leaves look like. So you'll notice that the leaves have started to open up. Oolong tea leaves are very small, and then they sort of open up quite a bit. So you'll notice it's covering a lot of the gaiwan here. And then I'll do a quick pour into our fair cup. Okay. All right, so if you've decanted your tea, the first thing I'd like you to do is to take a look at the tea liquor. Look at that golden color, very dark compared to the Long Jing that we just had. It also kind of represents the darker tea leaves, which have been sort of processed. I'm gonna give it a smell. The aromas are very interesting. Notes of chestnuts, almost like tropical fruit. Very sweet. And almost a bit of a roasted note, even though that's not a major quality of this tea. So I'm gonna go ahead and pour that in.
Matt, would you recommend we look at any specific part of that wheel of flavor, or is every tea different?
Yes, great question. So when it comes to the tea wheel, tea tasting is very individual. So in the beginning, I talked a little bit about all the different possible, flavors, but I think with the tea wheel, it's really an adventure for yourself to see, well, what do you like? So for example, I might be tasting things in this tea that you may not be tasting. And so one of the reasons tonight why I want to share kind of what I'm experiencing is it's just to show you my opinion. But if you're tasting something else, we'd love to hear about it, and make sure that you're writing that down within your notebook under the aroma of the tea.
That's
All right.
fantastic. So yes, please share your thoughts in the chat, folks. I see one person has said fermented barley smell. So we've got mushroom, umami.
Yes. Yep. It has lots of earthy and almost root vegetable flavor as well. It reminds me of roasted yams. And I think the earthiness is probably from the processing method as well as where the tea comes from. So I poured a little bit into my spoon. So if you haven't already, just take your spoon into your bowl and then just take a sip the same way we did before. We want to have quick sips back to put those tea molecules in the back of our throats. Wow. This is a very interesting tea. It's bursting with those flavors of roasted yams. With sort of, it's almost like if anyone's had dehydrated strawberries before, that's kind of what it tastes like. It's also got this beautiful herbal sort of character to it as well. From a texture perspective, one thing to note is this tea is also very smooth. It has a very rich flavor. It sort of reminds me of a California cab. So very sort of accessible and very smooth and a little bit sweet as well. So this character, one of the things I'd recommend when it comes to Taiwanese oolongs is try a lot of different kinds of them. So as I mentioned, there's the lower oxidized ones that are more floral and sweet. There is the more roasted qualities, high oxidation, that have a much more pungent, smoky flavor. If you like Scotch, highly recommend a roasted high oxidation oolong tea. Very interesting flavors. This one is somewhere in the middle where it's not really very light, but it has a very sweet and accessible quality. And so one of the things to note as well is that Taiwanese oolongs are actually some of the most well-known and sought-after teas in the world. And so one of the things that's interesting is that most of the production of Taiwanese oolong actually stays within the country. And that's because they fostered such an amazing tea culture out there that focuses on, obviously tasting, but also tea ceremony. So one of the things I mentioned before that makes the Taiwanese tea ceremony a little bit different from the Chinese one is this little contraption here. So this is an aroma cup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of my tea here. I'm going to pour it into my aroma cup. I'm going to put this over top. And I'll do a quick turnover. So the tall nature of this cup is actually going to allow me to smell the aromas even more. Now I'm smelling sort of rice. Someone had said apricots earlier. I'm getting a little bit more of that as well. Kind of like a dried fruit flavor as well, which is really neat. Aroma. So I encourage you to look at the tasting wheel within your tasting kits. Write down a couple of the different things that you think it tastes like within your notebook, and make sure that you're recording the wet leaf as well. So I'll just quickly review the sections that you want to include. The name of the tea is Gaba Oolong. It's from Nantao in Taiwan. It's a Oolong tea, which is the tea type. The dry sort of leaf aromas are it's interesting. It's very tight until you actually brew the tea and you get a lot more. They are kind of like licorice, anise, a little bit of earthiness to it as well. The aroma of this tea here, definitely roasted yams, even a bit of, I would say a bit of ripe fruit and definitely some apricots as well. And then in terms of the wet leaf, which we'll take a look at now. So you'll notice quite a difference from the actual smaller leaves, which look like this, to the unfurled leaves here that are much, much bigger. And so one of the things I always say with oolong is sometimes less is more. So if you think you don't have a lot of tea in there, once those leaves open, they're really infusing pretty heavily into the water.
I have definitely been guilty of putting too much tea in a cup and then dealing with a very bloomed leaf. But Matt, a question here from the audience. So you had talked about your aroma cup. Is there any value in smelling the cup after you've emptied the tea out of the vessel for those of us who don't have an aroma cup?
Absolutely. So the benefit of a cup like this, and this is specifically part of the Taiwanese tea ceremony, is as you're really looking to identify the flavors in an oolong tea, it really helps to do that. I can definitely send out a link after of where to get your own aroma cup. I find it's a really neat part of tea tasting, not just for Taiwanese oolongs, but for any kind of tea. This thing is great, even as, so typically if there were guests here, if we were all here in the same place, I would actually pass it off to anyone that's drinking tea to really get a scent of the tea before we drink it.
Fantastic, thank you. And yeah, we will absolutely include that information in the follow-up email to all attendees. So folks have an opportunity to really make this a part of their everyday lives if they do choose so.
Definitely.
Awesome. I think that's it from the audience for now, Matt.
Okay, so onwards to our black tea. I'm very excited about this tea. This is one of my favorites. What I will ask everybody to do is just to make sure their third cup and third bowl and spoon are ready, that they have water boiled. We'll take a couple of minutes just to get our water boiling and everything ready, but I'll tell you a little bit about black tea. So these beautiful leaves are a really unique type of black tea called Hongcha from Yunnan. So Yunnan is a province within China that's really actually well known for a bunch of really famous green teas, as well as one of my favorite teas, which is vintage pu'er tea. So that's a type of tea that can be aged. So what makes this tea really interesting is you'll notice that there's these gorgeous golden buds. They almost don't look like this would be black tea. In fact, the way there's a little hairs on the tea that remind me of white tea. So a tea like Silver Needle, where they're very delicate and very light. So this tea comes from Yunnan province in China. It's a very famous cultivar. And so in black teas in general, you can use boiling water. And so that really makes it easy for brewing here. When it comes to the Chinese black tea, it's processed very, very differently than, say, a Assam or an Indian tea, which has very different things. So if you've ever gotten like a red rose tea bag and you've seen these like little parts of tea dust, everyone assumes that it's sort of like the end of the tea or the bottom of the barrel. They're actually designed that way. So black tea bags go through a process called CTC, or crush, tear, curl. And the whole purpose of them is to optimize that black tea for tea bags. So because they're cut up into little pieces, the surface area that's available for the water is higher, which means that tea bag is going to brew a lot faster. Another interesting thing is around the production of iced tea. So, I love iced tea in the summer. I love to make iced tea, but sometimes you're just out and you want to grab an iced tea. That kind of tea, the highest qualities of tea, highest qualities of black tea are not actually ideal for iced teas because they have a bit of fogginess to it. And that comes from some of the sediment and the way the tea liquor hits. So they'll actually use a mid-range tea to make iced tea because the most important quality of iced tea when it's sitting in a glass with ice is clarity. So that's clear. So that's just a couple interesting facts about black tea. I'm going to be brewing this in a traditional Chinese Gungfu tea ceremony using a Yishin clay teapot. I'm going to take a minute here to get set up, boil my water, and I will tell you all about the Chinese tea ceremony.
That is awesome. And I think now that we have covered different regions of the teas that we are tasting this evening, we had a true or false question for everybody. So let's test the knowledge of the audience. We've got a true or false question here. England was the first European country to adopt tea into culture. True or false? All right, almost everybody is answered here. Matt, can you tell us, true or false, was England the first European country to adopt tea into culture?
So this is one of my favorite facts about tea. It was not, actually, it was Portugal. So in the 1600s, the first tea chests to arrive in Europe were actually in Portugal. And then shortly after, France and Holland started importing tea. England was actually the last country to import tea in Europe, which is so interesting because I always would have thought it would be the first.
I will continue watching Downton Abbey with a different lens.
Okay, so as I'm getting set up here, just a reminder that you need your third fillable tea bag. We want to take, again, about a half teaspoon to fill up the tea bag here. You'll notice these leaves are bigger. So if you need to eyeball it, don't worry. They're quite large. So, just make sure you've got around about 2.5 grams, just a small amount. So I would say probably about this amount. You want space in there as well. Fill it up, and then you're going to infuse that within your third cup. And we're going to let that sit for about 3 minutes. So this, one of the interesting things about black tea in China is it's actually called red tea. So Hong Cha means red tea. And the reason why is that in Chinese teas, there's actually another kind of tea, which is called dark tea. So dark tea is where you have these unique teas like pu'er, which I've talked about here. So I'll take a minute as my water is boiling to show you what pu'er looks like. So the most defining characteristic of pu'er is that it comes in this really interesting cake-like shape. So every cake that's built like this is exactly 357 grams. This is basically steamed and packed into this shape. And if we open it up, it looks like this little disc here. So it comes sort of formed in these shapes. And there's actually a long history about why, why it's packed into these shapes. It used to be used as currency. On the Tea Horse Road within China, it was used as also a way for travelers to have sustenance as well. So they used to not only brew the tea, but also eat the leaves. And as well, one of the most interesting things about this kind of tea is its ability to age. So pu'er tea is actually something I specialize in. And one of the most neat things about it is that over time, it actually improves. So a pu'er tea that's about 7 years is sort of the first drinkable sort of stage. And teas like this can actually age all the way up to 60 years. And at that point, the tea has improved, it's matured. Hopefully you've been able to tear off chunks over the years just to taste it, but it's an incredibly complex tea. So when I talk about tea being kind of similar to wine or whiskey or any other artisan beverage, it's really neat just because this tea itself, you could have a whole cellar full of this tea and it would be absolutely incredible just to see what it tasted like afterwards.
Thank you for that beautiful piece of history that I absolutely was not aware of. So that was fantastic, Matt. We've got another question here on from Jake. He says, some people say it's not a good idea to drink tea before trying to sleep, and curious if there's any truth to that.
Yeah, so I would definitely say that it's absolutely a matter of a personal preference. When it comes to caffeine, if somebody's very, very sensitive, I would say probably best to avoid it within a couple of hours of going to bed, even with steeping it, but it really depends on the individual.
That's awesome. And then I've got a question about tea, sugar, milk, honey. Where does that come into play? And is there any history that you can lend us that may provide a little bit more insight?
Yes, for sure. So when it comes to Chinese tea drinking culture, or let's call it China, Japan, Taiwan, a lot of the Asian countries, they don't typically add milk to it because the aromas and the flavor notes don't really work very well. I would say the exception is a lot of Chinese black teas have a richness to it. So if you're looking to add it in and on an individual basis, you want to try it out, absolutely. Generally, it's very much of a European culture to add sugar, milk, or honey. I always say to anybody who's interested in doing that, absolutely personal preference. It really just depends on how you like your tea. But I would say to try, when you buy a new tea or you want to try something out, definitely taste it first without milk or sugar or honey, and then see how you like it after that.
All right, Matt, we've got one more here. So Ken asks, is it okay to have tea without eating breakfast first in the morning, or any insight into the rituals of having tea first thing in the morning?
For sure. So when it comes to drinking tea in the morning, green teas can sometimes upset the stomach because of the acidity. So I would say you make sure you definitely want to eat some breakfast before you have green teas. With black teas, I often find as long as they're quite smooth and they're rich, I found that to be a really delicious way to start the morning. Generally, I find if you're looking to drink tea in the morning, try oolong teas. Oolong teas are really easy on the stomach. There's also a really wide range, and they're quite delicious, especially because it's not a very harsh sort of flavor first thing in the morning.
All right, that's fantastic. And we definitely have to do a shout out to some of our frontline healthcare workers who are saying that they can drink tea at any time of the day with the shift work that they're doing.
Definitely. Okay, so I'll walk you through a little bit about what's on the tea table here. So this is a traditional Chinese Gungfu tea ceremony. So the objective of a tea ceremony like this is really to bring the best expression of the leaf to life. So when we look at the first comment I often get is like, oh, everything's so small. And the reason is because we really only want to try a couple of sips of tea at the same time. So what I have here is, this is called a Yishin clay teapot. So Yishin clay comes from China. It's a porous clay that actually absorbs the oils from a tea. So any tea that is brewed within the Yishin clay teapot is, the oils are actually almost like consumed by the teapot. So they layer on almost like a cast iron pan. What's neat about it as well is the tea that comes out of these teapots after many years of layering the oil on is absolutely stunning. So I'm very excited to be brewing the Hongcha within here as well. The other thing is I've got a fair cup to decant in. You'll notice the theme of the evening is that we're decanting our tea because we very much want to taste it. This is called a fair cup, and I believe the name comes from because they wanted to make sure that everyone had equal amounts of tea. So instead of me pouring it into the teacup and maybe the third teacup isn't full, we're able to equally measure that. We need a tea filter. So typically this is terracotta with silk. You can use a metal one as well. This is to get any of the tea bits out of it as well. And then our cups, as well as our coasters, a set of tongs. And this is used for basically serving, just so that way you're not touching your cups. A tea pick. This is great for making sure your tea leaves are in there, and that if anything comes out, you can sort of scrape it away. And our scoop, which I've been using all night, which is made out of bamboo. So I'm going to show you typically how we would do a traditional Gungfu tea ceremony. Just for those of you who are tasting alongside with us, make sure that you have your tea bag. You've decanted it after a couple of minutes, and that you're ready to begin tasting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give the tea a bit of a rinse. And as we learned earlier, we're going to use this water to actually heat up our teaware so that it's an even temperature, so that we're not shocking the tea liquor when it goes into each of the different cups. Now, one of the interesting things about Chinese tea ceremonies, it's typically done very slow. It's an opportunity for us to slow down, to think about the mindfulness of making tea, and to also spend time together. All right, so now that I have warmed up my tea vessels and rinsed my tea leaves, I'm going to fill my Yishin teacup all the way. We're actually going to let it overflow. The reason why is we want the outside to absorb that tea oil and also to keep that heat in to the clay teapot. And we're going to let that sit for about 30 seconds.
Hey, Matt, now's a good time then as we're waiting for this. Do you have any recommendations on how folks should wash their cups or pots or teapots, whether they're clay or otherwise?
Definitely. So if you have a standard porcelain or ceramic cup that can take soap and water is fine. I find that sometimes soap can affect flavor. So if you're not comfortable with that, just use boiling water. With anything that you see here on the tea table that's made of a high quality porcelain or something porous, you definitely want to separate soap out of it. You want to use boiling hot water, immerse the teapots in that, and that will help clean everything else. So one of the things that we use boiling hot water to clean all of our utensils, just to make sure that we're not allowing the soap to affect the flavor of the tea. And now I'm pouring the tea into my fair cup.
All right, so folks should be pulling out their wheel of flavors again, I presume, Matt?
Yes, please. So if you haven't already, make sure that you've smelled the dry leaf. This is very sweet, marshmallow. I would definitely say a bit of cocoa. I can tell this is going to be a very rich tea. We want to smell the aroma of the tea liquor. Wow. Very smooth, very rich. Lots of vanilla and chocolate. This tea is a little bit less smooth than the last two that we tried. If you look at your tea wheel, you'll probably see a couple things that are very around sweet things. So I definitely think that goes around that. The the actual structure is very rich, very bold as well. Kind of like a, I would say this is kind of like a Bordeaux if you were to equate it to a wine. It's very in your face, it's very rich. And it's also a little bit dry right at the end as well. That's sort of balancing out those different sweeter notes. So this is an incredible tea. Definitely rare to find. And so I'd say if you have some more time later, definitely try re-steeping it in a smaller, in a small vessel and to drink it as well, because it's a very interesting tea. And so if you haven't already, I would recommend you open up your third page of your notebook, write down the tea, which is the Yunnan Hongcha, write down where it's from, China, tea type is black. The dry leaf appearance is very stringy, has the shiny golden buds, which really denotes quality. It has a really sweet, mellow, chocolatey aroma. And the tasting notes are very smooth, lots of vanilla chocolate there, and sort of cocoa as well. But I'm very curious to hear what everyone else is tasting.
Well, I very sheepishly said that I taste a bit of maple. Suki is saying nutty notes.
Definitely a bit of nutty notes for sure. Mm-hmm. I actually taste a bit of pistachio right at the end. Caramel, definitely. One quick thing about the tasting wheel is it's definitely a guideline, but as many things are, tea is a beverage that's very individual, whether it's with the teaware that we use, whether it's with water or the size of the brewing vessel. And so it's, definitely prepare tea the way that you enjoy it. Be open to trying it lots of different ways, but if you want to add milk or sugar to it, then yeah, by all means. So it's very individual.
I won't add any milk or sugar tonight, but I'm glad I have the permission to do so. Corey has a question for you, Matt, and is asking, in your setup of all three of the teas, are you still using that 2.5 grams to 250 milliliter ratio, or is it more concentrated with certain teas?
Yes, so we are definitely trying for about 2.5 grams roughly. So this teapot here is about 200 milliliters. The Gaiwan here is about 100 to 150. And then our largest brewing vessel was here, which was about, this would, I guess halfway through would be about 200.
Thank you for that. We've got a question about tasting a little bit of metallic and wondering, could that potentially be the spoon, or is that something that the tea may be giving off?
So let me have a taste. Definitely a metallic flavor right in the mid-tongue. It's sort of like, it's almost like a copper kind of flavor to it. Copper, kind of iron, probably.
All right, thank you. And then from Brent, asking if it's important to pour off all the water and not let the leaves sit in water inside the teapot.
Yes, definitely. So if you're preparing tea for tasting, where we're using a smaller vessels, let's say just a cup of water, you definitely want to take the leaves out and put it on a separate dish so that way the leaves are not over steeping, so you can taste that first infusion. The other thing as well is that I highly encourage you to fill up the cup for any of the three teas that we've tasted tonight to see what the second, third, maybe even fourth infusion tastes like, because you'll notice the tea can change over time. If you're looking to start out as well on tea tasting, I highly recommend getting something like this, like an infusion beaker or a gaiwan, which will allow you to measure a little bit more accurately the water and then the tea ratio.
Awesome. Well, that was a fantastic answer, because it also answered Susan's question of if the tea changes as it cools.
It does, for sure. So one of the interesting things about tea overall is that it's a very dynamic beverage. So when you think about mixing heat, water, tea together, it's always changing. So you want to make sure that, for example, if the weather is different from one time that you drank tea to another, that might be affecting it. I often find with the pu'er teas that I have that different times of the year or even different days that the teas might taste a little bit different. So it's definitely a bit of a journey just to see how to perfect that tea making based on the elements.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Matt, over to you. I know we're nearing the end of our time here, and we wanted to provide a bit of time at the end for some of those final questions and a couple closing notes. So
yes,
I'll pass it back over to you.
Perfect. Yeah. So tonight we've walked through 3 different teas. We've tasted the Longjing green tea, the Gaba Oolong, and then the Yunnan black tea. And the reason why we tasted it in that order was because we wanted to get the lightest, most subtle flavors, and then onwards to the more brisk flavors as well. The fillable tea bags and the teas themselves are a really good way to enjoy tea. If you have a strainer at home or something that's even like a gaiwan or something like that, then I would definitely recommend it. As we're tasting, it's a little bit different than tea drinking in that we're trying to identify all those different characters as part of it. With the Gungfu Chinese tea ceremony here, I should be able to actually brew tea out of this teapot at least 10 to 15 more times. And so, as you can imagine, that would take a lot of time. And so it's just a great way to identify. I often find as I'm brewing tea in a smaller brewing vessel, sometimes the 5th or the 7th or even the 10th infusion brings out flavors that I wouldn't have imagined in the beginning. So make sure that you're sort of experimenting, trying things out, and that you're always recording as well. So the notebooks that we've sent out, highly recommend using them as your tea journal as you move forward. The most important things are just to always capture all the different types of teas that you're drinking, what are the flavor notes, and use the tea wheel as a guideline to help you sort of determine and build up that palate for when it comes to tea. So we've got a little bit of time left. I would love to open it up to any last questions that we have here.
Yes, absolutely. Let's get some of these questions in. I had one from earlier that I would be remiss to not ask, in which is, where can folks get the gooseneck tea kettle that you have? That's an important one.
Yep. So the tea, I guess I've got 2 different ones. One's a Hario over here. This one is a Quizimax. This one I use primarily for when I'm doing tea tasting events or tea tastings. But if you're looking for a good all-around gooseneck kettle, Amazon has the Hario 1.2 liter kettle in lots of different colors, including a copper one that's on my wish list. But yeah, it's a really great lightweight teapot that will work on any sort of cooking surface.
Fantastic. And I might just tip off Anna and say now may be a good time to pop that survey into the chat, because we have a few folks commenting on, will we be doing something like this again? And, I think the answer might be a resounding yes. This seems to have been very popular. So if folks do have 2 minutes to let Matt know how he did and how this has landed for folks, we would be happy to receive your feedback. But another question, what is the purpose of the wooden stand that you have everything on, Matt?
Yes, so this wooden tea table actually has a drawer underneath. So it's typically used for draining water down. So one of the things is that Chinese and Taiwanese tea ceremony requires a lot of rinsing of things, a lot of pouring of tea leaves, lots of loose tea drops everywhere. The little drawer underneath catches all of that water, so that it makes cleanup really easy. It's also a really beautiful presentation just to put your teaware on.
Absolutely. Fantastic. People learning lots of thanks coming through. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Matt, it might be a natural time to thank you in general for everything that you have done. Just putting this all together for everybody and creating such a beautiful space for people to come together. I know we would love to do this in person, but I think this is a second best great thing. And we've just valued your expertise, and thank you as a BCIT alumnus to come back and share your fantastic knowledge with everybody.
Thanks very much, Ali. I really appreciate the time, and thank you for everybody who joined. If you're interested in learning more about tea or wanting to find out about any of the teaware or teas that we shared today, feel free to check out our website at chongtea.co. We have another event coming up on March 11th that's focused on Chinese teas, which we're also doing a tea kit that's a little bit separate. But I want to thank everybody so much and the BCIT Alumni Association for having me tonight. I wish there was more time. I feel like we breezed through that, but I hope all of you walked away with some new insight into tea and inspired to open up those cabinets and see what's in there.
Absolutely, Matt. And I think everybody has that same desire to crack open that cupboard and see what loose leaves we can match to the tasting wheel. So thank you very much. Anna, if you could share that survey again for folks before you leave, should take about 2 minutes to fill out and share your feedback with us. But ultimately, we also want to thank our event sponsors for otherwise this event would not be possible. So just thank you, big thanks to TD Insurance as well as BMO. Both of these partners offer exclusive benefits to BCIT alumni. So by partaking in these programs, what you do is help generate revenue for the Alumni Association in support of these programs, events, and ultimately donations to our students. So thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for our event sponsors, and thank you, Matt. Following the event, we will be sending out an email that will include a recording of the event, so you'll be able to watch it from A to Z again and perhaps share it with any of your family members or fellow alumni around the world. And we'll also include information on how to connect with Matt, where to purchase teas, and how to continue your tea journey. So Matt, if you have any final parting words, over to you, but thank you everyone for being here this evening.
Yep, that's it. Thanks everybody. I really appreciate the time and attention, and enjoy your teas. Thanks
Thank you,
very much.
everybody. Have a fantastic evening.